Hi everyone, thank you very much for joining me for this talk about Guildhall Art Gallery and its collections. My name's Katty Pearce and I'm curator at Guildhall Art Gallery, and it also has London's Roman Amphitheatre underneath it as part of the site. I won't be talking much about the amphitheatre, but I will be talking about the paintings collection and some of the things you'll see if you are able to visit us at any point. So thank you for joining us on a very hot afternoon. I appreciate your time. So this is a brief introduction to what we collect, how we present it. This is our top level, and as you'll see, you'll probably notice that many of the works on display here are Victorian gems, and they range through from narrative and genre paintings to pre-Raphaelites and aesthetic works. Much of the Victorian collection was collected at the time in the 19th century as contemporary art, and that reflects the fact that there was an art gallery of the site at Guildhall open to the public from 1886, and previously the City of London Corporation, which is the organisation that manages and maintains Guildhall Art Gallery, is the local authority really for the city, the square mile. And over and above it being a modern local authority, it's also a historic enclave, if you like, that has really been the kind of governing institution for what was originally the walled city of London, so the site that Greater London really grew out from. So Roman London set the pattern that then medieval London grew out of, and the City of London Corporation became the kind of the governing body that had its own rights and its own charters, and so it's a historically interesting place to visit. Always something new to learn about it. But with the collection, the City of London has collected work really since the time of the Great Fire of London, and originally its collections were private. They weren't publicly available until that great metropolitan art gallery building effort that was put across the whole nation really in the Victorian period. So much of our collection is on London as much as it is 19th century, and what you'll see when you visit us is sort of two main spaces that look at Victorians as contemporary works, as how they relate to today as well, and also images of London and its history, its topographical and geographical change, its stories that come out of it. And our aim really is to be an art gallery for London, reflecting London artists, London subject matter, London scenes for London people and anyone who chooses to visit us, as well as dealing with kind of city ceremonials, which we'll come on to later. I'll talk more about the very large painting that you can see right in the middle of that picture, because that is very interesting in itself and informed the construction of the modern gallery that you'll see today. Sadly, the Victorian gallery that was there was destroyed in the Blitz in 1941, and so we are a more modern building, but with this very interesting historical context. So this is an example of one of the London collection, which are situated in our Undercroft gallery on the lower floor, and that is part of the original Victorian building that's kind of been reconstructed, which is a very peaceful and serene place to experience some different scenes of London and its history. This is the Thames during the Great Frost of 1739. By the Dutch artist Jan Griffier, and it is one of those, it's a very, very small painting. You can see a lot more detail up close, and hopefully this image gives you something of the minutiae of it. And in that typical style, it's an incredibly detailed and gem-like little piece, and it reflects the idea of the frost fair. Before the Thames was embanked, it was a much wider river, and because it was wider, it flowed a lot slower. And because the climate was very different, there were periods where winters were cold enough, and pretty much from medieval up to the point of sort of 18th, 19th century, really, the climate became incredibly cold for very extended periods of time, really, over winter and sometimes up to Easter and beyond. And the Thames would freeze over. The Thames was capable of doing that because it flowed very slowly. And when it froze over, it was seen as an occasion. And like with Londoners today, really, anything is seen as a chance for a party. And so frost fairs would happen where the city would go out onto the frozen river. Merchants and traders would set up tents. People would go out to buy food. They would have ice skating. You'd meet your friends. You'd be seen. And you can see all this kind of glorious detail in the foreground, these tiny figures skating and falling over, embarrassing themselves, playing with friends. You have kind of runaway dogs slipping on the ice, and all kinds of little slice of life details. Often you can also see on the sort of left center quadrant of the painting, there's a what looks like a maypole, some sort of communal dance activity or something going on, and little ice skates drawn in very, very small detail, with a view around the bend of the river to St. Paul's, which you will see is, as it isn't today, the largest structure within the city. What's also notable are just the sheer number of spires that there are through for the city churches, just how many churches there were in a very, very small space. And most of those churches are still in existence and can be visited, and they're very fascinating, sort of charting the history of the city and its various religious changes. And different livery companies, sort of the trade guilds of London, have different associations with the different churches, and their banqueting halls and things are still dotted around. You can also see the monument, if you look very carefully, right sort of in the centre line, off slightly to the right. So you get a sense of the scale of the city around this time in the 1730s, and a kind of an appreciation for the city from the eye of a Dutch artist, really, who is painting in this particular style that comes from his own time and place, but applying that eye to a British capital. But this is the image that you saw in the first picture that I showed you, the photograph. That is the enormous canvas that is hung on the very far wall. Our gallery is the only one I can think of, really, that has sort of it was architecturally designed to accommodate one painting. So the reason we have a balcony split level and a very, very large wall at the end is so that this painting could be displayed. It's called Defeat of the Floating Batteries at Gibraltar, and it is by the American artist John Singleton Copley. The reason I show this to you is because its production history is probably the most interesting thing about it, aside from if you like battle scenes and kind of military and naval history, which is a very fantastic example of a kind of action painting. Although you will notice that there is a split, really, in its style and subject matter between the right and the left-hand side. So originally, the City of London Corporation wanted to commission a painting, a very grand history painting, which dealt with this victory of the British over the Spanish in conflict over Gibraltar. And initially, Copley was selected to do this commission, and it took him 2 years to complete an enormous painting. And we believe, and we haven't yet been contradicted, that it is the largest oil on canvas on display anywhere in the country. So it's sort of worth a look. It's notable, even if this kind of subject matter doesn't quite do it for you. But you'll notice on the left-hand side, you have this incredibly dramatic, almost romantic with a capital R, depiction of sailors dying, suffering in the sea, drowning, rescuing each other as they jump off burning ships. And initially, the whole canvas really was that subject, and it's depicting the British Navy's generosity, I suppose, and humanity in rescuing Spanish sailors who they have bombarded and with cannon and set their ships alight. A floating battery is really it's sort of a defensive strategy where you would line ships up end to end across a coastline to defend it, and so the British were kind of bombarding those ships, setting them on fire. And you have some fantastic detail of soldiers in various dramatic and indeed melodramatic posture. But the corporation didn't like what Copley had initially done. So that 2 years that he had spent was a waste of time, really, because the patrons who were paying for it said, well, we wanted it to show a military victory, and basically a lot of their friends and connections were the various generals and army bigwigs who had been part of this battle. And so the point was to display them and their glory and to honour them and have them depicted. All of these people on the right-hand side in the red coats, the army, they had scattered to the four corners of Europe, really, by the time that Copley was painting it, and he had to go to their various locations, sit them down and take portraits from life in order to be able to put them into the painting and reconfigure the painting. And hence a lot of white covering smoke in the middle, which sort of disguises what's underneath, and this odd foregrounding, this perspective that's slightly off, with the wall just zigzagging from the centre line of the canvas round, just to give you a slight sort of split from the other grouping. And it took Copley another 7 years to complete this picture, because he'd been sent on this goose chase around Europe. And when he finally was ready to come and present it to the corporation, he was hugely out of pocket. He had to pay for all of these adjustments himself. He'd had to pay for his travel. He didn't get any more money from the corporation at all to do this. And so he decided he wasn't going to turn the painting over to them. What he was going to do, being an enterprising artist with a sort of commercially minded chap, he set up an enormous marquee in Green Park, mounted this painting on a structure and charged people a shilling to come and look at it. So it's sort of 18th century IMAX experience, a chance to see something enormous and dramatic before it disappeared into the Guildhall and would be seen for quite some time. The painting is on display now because it was delivered to the city. It was rolled on an enormous, like a tube, and removed just before the Second World War started to protect it, and a lot of other works that survive were removed and taken out to different storage locations around the country, as happened with the National Gallery and other museums. Works were taken away and hidden for safety, and this was then restored in the late 90s for when the gallery reopened in 1999, and it's not actually in its frame that's around it. The frame just sits on top of it because the structure is so enormous that any frame wouldn't be able to take the weight of it, so it's a kind of false frame, but it's quite something to imagine it rolled up and then unrolled and conserved so that it looks like it's not been anywhere. It's quite a thing to have a look at. I mentioned that there were ceremonial and city themed pictures in our collection. There's a small grouping of them on the ground floor, and this also intersects with the idea of Victorian art and what it does, really. This is a depiction of the Lord Mayor's Show from 1888 by William Logsdale, and the Lord Mayor's Show is something that still happens. The Lord Mayor is it's more of a ceremonial role, but he is as distinct from the Metropolitan Mayor of London. The Lord Mayor, there has been a Lord Mayor in the city for 800 years. They change over every year, it's a different person, and their role is to be an ambassador for the financial district, to travel, to kind of raise business interests, to do those ceremonial and ritualistic functions, which form part of the sort of history and ritual of the city. This 9th of November that's usually when the Lord Mayor's Show happens, around that time. Every November. It used to be a river pageant, but because it's in November, that doesn't tend to go very well weather-wise, so it's become a road procession. You see the Lord Mayor's carriage there and the sense of light that's picked up on the gold. The Lord Mayor is the only office of state or ceremonial office that has a coach with 6 horses. The Queen and royal coaches of states have 8. And I think anything less than that are, dukes, and people are allowed 4, but the Lord Mayor is allowed 6 by arrangement, for who knows what mechanisms, but by tradition, I suppose. And the Lord Mayor, it's a show in the sense that the Lord Mayor is showing himself to the people. But it's obviously become a big kind of pageant and procession over over the years. The artist picks out the rain and reflections on the street, so you get the sense of London being paved with gold, paved with opportunity. You have the Royal Exchange in the background, so again this heart of finance and wealth building, also of empire and colonial history. On the left, you have the Bank of England and a sort of health and safety nightmare. On the top left, on the rooftops, you can see all these little figures who are standing on the roofs overlooking to get a better view, people who've probably paid to be up there, or bankers who have access. And then down on the street, the I think most interesting bit of the painting, which is where the major interest of any Victorian painting is, and that is in the crowd. It's a fantastic collection of people, of faces and expressions and business and relationships. You have a soldier flirting or looking with some sort of malign intent perhaps towards a young lady in a hat. You have the city policeman doing Victorian crowd control, just holding back a crowd with his hands relatively successfully, considering that there's nothing else to stop them surging forward. You have this wonderful, on the right bottom corner, little boy picking up a hat from the street and a dog running around, and this tiny girl who is the only figure apart from the central one who is looking out at you as a viewer. And I think the artist is really bringing your attention to this idea of rich and poor, of two different Londons, the one of privilege and the one of poverty. And lots of the faces in the crowd are sort of revealing of that, really, that this is an enormous city, and there was lots of anxiety in the 1880s about crowds, about sort of contamination, not just physical and medical, but social. This is also the year in which Jack the Ripper murders were occurring, and a lot of these people are from the eastern sort of East End and the boundary from the city into the East End. So there's a kind of anxiety and a desire to reflect London in all its variety in this painting. Pre-Raphaelites. We have a few Pre-Raphaelites in our collection, and this is probably the best known, La Ghirlandata by Rossetti, but all the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, Millet and Holman Hunt, are also represented. And again, these reflect the taste for Pre-Raphaelite art at the time, which the Victorian gallery director Alfred Temple was keen to collect, and he was quite good at haggling prices as well, so he did very well in getting artists to give him their works. And this is what really the Victorian public expected to see in their art galleries, and arguably it's what we expect to see when we think of a 19th century collection, or when we think of Victorian art. We think not just of sort of sentimentalism or genre pictures or narrative art, but we think of these red-headed stunners and Pre-Raphaelite detail in terms of natural observations, and as well as we might think of sort of social realism as another branch of Victorian art. But this Pre-Raphaelite style was what British art became known for, and it sort of changed the direction of what was being done before. Now, Rossetti painted this while he was recovering from a suicide attempt. Actually, he was staying with William Morris at Kelmscott, the house they co-owned, and he had just started getting back into painting. And although this model was Alexa Wilding, a model he worked with quite a number of times and was one of the few that he wasn't having a relationship with, but she looks an awful lot like Jane Morris, William Morris's wife, who Rossetti had fallen madly in love with. And so we get this kind of vision of Jane leaking through. You also get in the angels in the top right and left corner a reflection of Jane, because May Morris, Jane and William's daughter and designer in her own right, modelled for those. So you have this sort of obsessive kind of vision of this woman or women. The Ghirlandata just means the garlanded one, and the garland is these sort of creeping vines around her. But it's a sensory picture that has a suggestion of scent in the honeysuckle. It has a suggestion of music in the instrument, which is, it's not a harp. I now can't remember what it's called, but it's a particular instrument of its own. It's a harp-like instrument. You have a bird also singing, and Rossetti himself thought this was one of his finest pieces and called it the greenest painting in the world. He was also trying to hint at a sort of dark erotic symbolism with the use of these purple flowers in the foreground, which were, he thought, monkshood, which is a poisonous flower, but he actually got his botanical observation wrong, and he's painted larkspur, which is in fact harmless. So I'm not quite sure what message we take from that, but it's not quite the symbolism that he intended. But it's a great example of the sort of subjectless painting, almost an art for art's sake piece that's designed as a sensory experience rather than as a story. On to Millet, who painted these two companion piece pictures, my first sermon on the left and my second sermon there on the right. This is his daughter Effie, and these are really sort of a Victorian joke, I think. You know, there's a setup in that he paints this idyllic picture of a little girl in church for the first time. On the left, my first sermon, that she's perfectly dressed, she's behaving, she's attentive, she's doing everything society wants children to do. And this was an incredibly popular painting in its time, and people queued around the block at the Royal Academy to see it, and it was considered this charming and innovative vision of childhood. And as if to puncture that balloon, he then gave us my second sermon the year after, where the novelty is well and truly worn off. And this is much more, I think, what parents of any era, even Victorian parents, recognise as real. And so it's a good way of juxtaposing that sort of the ideals of childhood, the ideals of what society wants and expects, and what it actually has. And I think Victorian artists are always incredibly interested in that gap between ideals and reality, and they're always a lot more interested in reality than we think they are. But it's a really nice way of just commenting on the differences between what we later culture see as Victorian values. They are perhaps not quite what we think they are. There are lots of theatrical and dramatic paintings in our collection. This is just an example of one which I find a particular favourite. This is the banquet scene in Shakespeare's Macbeth. Victorian art is nothing if not obsessed with narrative and story, if it's not in that sort of pre-Raphaelite kickback against that. But there are lots of artists in our collection who are working on literature, on history, on theatre and performance, music, poetry. And this is one of those examples where it positions the viewer as an audience member, really, and it's giving you a scene from Shakespeare that would have had as a sort of common currency in that an educated audience understand the text or have exposure to the text, but it's also doing something for an audience that Victorian society was keen to engage, people who didn't have that sort of formal education, people who were coming to actually learn that in an art gallery context. And it was part of the sort of moral endeavour of public museums and galleries was an educative one to democratise knowledge, really, and to give culture to the masses, to allow people access and for the betterment of society, or at least that was the aim. So I want to also talk about some of the contemporary acquisitions that we've recently made, because we don't want to just be a gallery that sits on a historic collection and doesn't add to it, doesn't move it forward, doesn't say anything about our modern times. And we recently acquired this incredible collection of photographs by Liz Johnson Arter. With her, we curated this selection from her work. She's a British, Ghanaian, Russian artist who works around South London and Peckham. She's done a history of fashion photography and culture and journalistic photography, but she works around Peckham and different Black communities around South London, and she photographs everything from club culture to religious ceremonies to working life, social gatherings. She kind of does this sort of overview really, and picks out these pockets of culture that we hope, in the reason to collect something like this, of course, is so that in 100, 200 years time, people understand what does London look like in 2018, who is creating art in 2018, and what are they saying. That this is an addition to our London collection. So we jump from the Frost Fair of the 1700s to Peckham into 2018, and hopefully that gives a real span and depth to the collection, as well as diversifying and representing who is there now and who is working now. Likewise, this fantastic piece by Uzo Egonu, a British-Nigerian artist, of Tower Bridge, which is the classic red, white and blue colouring, but with his Igbo patterning and his own Nigerian heritage woven through it. And this is from 1969, where he was coming to London, studying art and starting to work, and creating these incredible almost abstract perspectives of popular landmarks. And he does these sort of classic London images, which are all woven through with his Nigerian heritage, as well as forming a particularly sort of British and diasporic aesthetic. I will bid you good evening, and thank you very much for joining me.